Hello to everyone. Now we are going to discuss about the research process in continuation to the previous video. We are going to continue the research process in detail. I am Professor Dr. K.S.Rangasamy, Department of MBA, K.S.Rangasamy College of Technology. The first step of research process is formulating the research problem. As I specified in my previous video, like the half defined research problem, clearly defined research problem is half solved. So with that note, let us check out how to formulate the research problem. So initially the research problem stated in a broad and general way, which means before starting any research, so we cannot have a specific research problem and crystallized research problem. It is impossible to have such kind of specific research problem very immediately and initially. So gradually any researcher will get into the research process and then gradually he will come to the phase of crystallizing the research problem. So there are two types of defining research problem. The first can be that any research problem can be crystallized based on the state of nature. According to the nature of the research problem, so we can understand, the researcher can understand the research and then he can crystallize based on the state of nature. And again, the second type is, so any researcher can crystallize the research problem based on the relationship between the variables. So obviously, there might be a lot of variables in a particular research problem, but still the researcher have to know that what kind of variable need to be studied and what is the scope of the research, till what end the particular research is going to investigate that particular variable. So that has to be specified in the scope of research. So based on these two types, any research problem can be crystallized by the researcher. The two steps in formulating the research problem is, the first is understanding the research problem thoroughly. So when I starting this particular slide, I told you that any research problem which is clearly defined is half solved. So based on that note, so we can understand that understanding the research problem thoroughly is the first important step while formulating the research problem. And the very next is rephrasing the same into meaningful terms from an analytical point of view. So which means any research problem can be rephrased into a meaningful problem. So based on the crystallization of hypothesis, because hypothesis is the assumed statement for investigation which contains various variables needs to be studied through that particular research. So any researcher has to be necessarily understand the research problem and it has to be converted into meaningful terms based on clear-cut hypothesis. And the very next is extensive literature survey. So literature survey is the very important step where many of the researchers lack to follow this particular step or they forgot in the total research process. Collecting the research literature is one of the key element in research process. It is because literature will give you basic idea for the researcher to conduct that particular research. Which means any researcher can easily understand that the whole research process from the previous researcher, what kind of method they have followed and what kind of sampling design they have adopted and what kind of samples they have taken. So which nation that particular research has been conducted, what is the nature of that particular research in that particular nation and what kind of scope that particular research get involved into that. So those kind of areas can be easily analyzed that particular researcher by collecting various literatures. So the key and important and initial step for any research is collecting various literatures, and that literature need not be very oldest literatures. It has to be a latest literature so that the researcher will understand what kind of trend that particular research is following and what are all the variables have been already studied, what are all the variables which is missed in previous literatures, that can be easily understood by the researcher by collecting various literature. So a researcher should undertake an extensive literature survey connected with that particular research problem. There are two types of literatures. The first literature type is called as a conceptual literatures, which concerning the concepts and theories, so which needs to be investigated. So if it is relevant to that particular research, the researcher can undergo this, or else they can go for the empirical literature surveys, where the research studies made earlier, which is very similar to that research process or research problem that which is proposed to study. So that kind of empirical literatures can be collected by the researcher, and they can go for this kind of literature survey. And development of working hypothesis, just as I said in my previous slide, working hypothesis is nothing but it is a statement which is assumed statement, needs to be investigated by understanding various variables. So a researcher should be in clear terms, they have to crystallize the research hypothesis. There need not be there should not be any kind of irrelevant terminologies, irrelevant phrases in research hypothesis. So working hypothesis is a tentative assumption made in order to draw out a test and test its logical and empirical consequences. So the role of hypothesis is to guide the researcher by delimiting the research area or keep him in right track, which means you need not get deviated from the research issue, and the researcher need to be on track in that research process. So to keep him on track, this research hypothesis is the blueprint for the researcher. So it indicates the type of data which is required to be collected and to be studied. So it indicates the type of data required and type of method of data analysis to be used. So all these things are possible to have a right kind of hypothesis. How does the researcher go about developing working hypothesis? It is very simple. The researcher has to necessarily understand the variables. Based on that variables, so the variables needs to be studied through that research. Based on that variable, they can undergo the hypothesis framing process. So the next step is preparing the research design. The research design is a description of conceptual structure within which the research will be conducted. The research design indicates what kind of method the researcher is going to adopt for data collection, and what kind of skill set a researcher must possess to conduct that research, and what is the execution plan for collecting data, and what are all the resources which is available on hand, and how much finance amount is required to conduct that particular research. All these things needs to be crystallized in research design crystallization process. And researcher would indicate the design, either experimental design or formal design, and what is the suitable design which is with minimum bias. The purpose of crystallizing the research design or fixing the research design is to minimize the bias and to maximize the reliability of data. That is the ultimate purpose of crystallizing the research design. So with this note, we'll continue our session in our next video. Thank you.